a holiday shadowed by war. As Passover arrives, families across Israel are asking a question that no one can answer with certainty. Will this holiday be marked by family, faith, and tradition, or by sirens, shelters, and another week under fire? That is the reality of this moment. A holiday that should represent freedom now unfolds under the shadow of missiles, military warnings, and a regional war that still shows no clear endpoint. Across the country, people are preparing dinner tables while also preparing safe rooms. They are planning family gatherings while also checking alert systems. They are trying to preserve some sense of ritual in a time when daily life is still being interrupted by incoming threats. And that is what makes this moment feel so heavy, because this is no longer just about military strategy or diplomatic headlines. This is about the emotional collision between normal life and wartime reality. One of the oldest and most meaningful Jewish holidays is arriving at the same time that the war with Iran appears to be entering one of its most dangerous phases. Instead of a ceasefire, there is uncertainty. Instead of calm, there is tension. Instead of clear reassurance, there are warnings from Washington, signals of possible escalation, and growing talk that the next major move may be closer than many expected. On the surface, the language coming from the United States still leaves room for negotiation. Officials say talks continue behind the scenes. There are still references to diplomacy, off-ramps, and possible arrangements that could prevent a much wider conflict. But beneath that language, something else is becoming impossible to ignore. Military pressure is increasing, strategic patience is shrinking, and the sense that time is running out is now hanging over every major conversation about this war. The question is no longer simply whether Iran and Israel remain locked in a dangerous confrontation. That is already obvious. The real question is whether the conflict is approaching a turning point, or whether everything we have seen so far is only the prelude to something even larger. That is why Passover matters in this story. Not only because of what it means spiritually, but because holidays expose the true weight of war. They reveal whether a society can still pause, still breathe, still gather, still hold on to routine, or whether the war has already pushed too deeply into the national bloodstream for that to be possible. And right now, many Israelis are preparing for the second possibility, because as of this moment, there is little reason to assume that the sirens will stop simply because the calendar says it is a sacred week. There is little reason to believe that the men directing this war from Tehran will suddenly decide to respect a religious holiday, and there is even less reason to assume that a conflict this intense, this ideological, and this strategically layered will pause out of sentiment. That is the cold reality of day 30. The war does not care that a holiday is beginning. The missiles do not care that families are trying to sit together. The strategic calculations in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Washington do not stop for tradition. And so this Passover begins not in calm, but in suspense. It begins with one eye on the table and one eye on the sky. It begins with hope, yes, but also with fear. It begins with the uncomfortable understanding that this holiday may not mark a pause in the war at all. It may mark the start of an even more dangerous chapter. The war has entered a different stage. 30 days into this conflict, the atmosphere has changed. This no longer feels like an early war, a temporary exchange, or a limited cycle of retaliation. It feels like a war that has hardened, a war that has found its rhythm, a war that is no longer asking whether it will continue, but how far it will go before someone finally forces a decisive outcome. That change matters, because in the opening days of any major conflict, uncertainty itself creates restraint. Governments test one another, red lines are probed, messages are sent through calibrated actions. Everyone wants leverage, but not everyone wants immediate catastrophe. Now, however, much of that ambiguity is fading. Israel continues to operate under missile pressure, while signaling that it intends to keep hitting the infrastructure behind the threat. Iran continues to absorb punishment while projecting defiance and trying to convince the world that it still controls the pace of escalation. The United States continues speaking the language of negotiation while building the kind of military posture that suggests it is prepared for the possibility that negotiation will fail. And around all of that, the region is becoming more volatile. Shipping lanes remain under pressure. The Strait of Hormuz remains a strategic trigger point. Energy fears continue to ripple outward. and every new statement from Washington is analyzed not only for what it says publicly, but for what it may be preparing privately. That is why this stage of the war feels more dangerous than the first. In the beginning, the risk was sudden escalation. Now the risk is structured escalation. Now the pieces are being arranged. Now the deadlines, troop movements, threats, and diplomatic signals are beginning to line up. That creates a new kind of fear, because when major powers begin to synchronize rhetoric with military posture, it often means they are moving closer to a moment of decision. The war may still appear fluid from the outside, but underneath it, calculations are becoming sharper. What must be destroyed? What leverage must be removed? What would count as victory? What would count as failure? How much more time should be given? And what happens when time runs out? These are not abstract questions anymore. They are now central to the conflict. This is especially true because the war is no longer confined to one dimension. It is military, yes, but it is also political, economic, maritime, ideological, and psychological. It is being fought in the skies, in shipping routes, in statements from world leaders, in oil markets, in internal public morale, and in the perception of who is gaining and who is bleeding. And that perception matters enormously. Wars do not end only when one side loses capability. They also end when one side loses faith in the idea that time is working in its favor. So long as Iran believes it can survive, outlast, and preserve enough leverage to shape the final settlement, it has reason to continue. So long as Israel believes that stopping now would leave the core threat intact, it has reason to push further. So long as the United States believes that more pressure may still produce concession, it has reason to keep tightening the vice. That is what makes this stage so unstable. Everyone still believes there is something to gain from pressing harder, and when all sides believe that at once, wars tend to expand before they contract. This is why the coming days are so important. Not because the region is calm, but because it is not. Not because things are slowing, but because all the signals now point in the opposite direction. What we are watching is a war moving away from its opening chapter and toward a potentially decisive threshold. The holiday begins, but the conflict is not pausing. It is evolving. Trump's message: negotiation on the surface, pressure underneath. One of the defining features of this phase of the war is the contradictory tone coming from Washington. On one side, the message is that negotiations are still ongoing. There are back-channel contacts, strategic discussions, and continued suggestions that diplomacy has not yet been abandoned. The United States still wants the option of ending this war through an agreement rather than through a much broader military operation. But on the other side, the message is unmistakably harder. There are warnings of a response. There are public threats. There are signals that if Iran continues testing the limits, the answer may not remain rhetorical for long. This dual track is not accidental. It is pressure diplomacy. It is the art of speaking as if the door is open while moving military and political pressure in such a way that the other side understands the door is closing. President Trump has always used this style in his own way, sometimes deliberately contradictory, sometimes disruptive, sometimes confusing even to allies. But in conflicts like this, that confusion can itself be part of the strategy. If your adversary cannot fully predict whether you are bluffing, whether you are delaying, or whether you are preparing to strike, then uncertainty becomes a weapon. And right now, uncertainty is clearly being weaponized. Iran is hearing one message in public: there is still a path to de-escalation, but it is also hearing another message underneath it: do not mistake diplomacy for weakness. Do not mistake delay for indecision. Do not assume that because the United States is still talking, it has ruled out acting. That combination matters because Iran's leadership must now calculate under pressure. If it believes the United States is only trying to scare it, then it may continue absorbing attacks and wait for Western political fatigue to take over. If it believes the military threat is real, however, then the cost of delay rises sharply. That is what Washington appears to be trying to create: a final interval in which Tehran must choose between painful compromise and far greater danger. It is a dangerous strategy, but not an irrational one. Because if the White House had only talked about negotiations, Iran might interpret that as an invitation to stall. If it had only talked about military action, it might lose the political argument that it tried diplomacy first. By mixing both, Washington preserves flexibility. It can still say it sought a peaceful outcome, but it can also say that if force becomes necessary, force was preceded by warning. The complication, of course, is that this approach can also unsettle allies and confuse the international environment. When public messages swing between negotiation and strike warnings, partners do not always know how serious either side of the message truly is. Markets become nervous, governments hesitate, adversaries look for cracks, but perhaps that is still preferable, in the White House view, to giving Tehran a predictable script, because predictability helps a regime like Iran. Ambiguity puts pressure on it. This is especially important now because the central issue is no longer only Israel's immediate security. It is also the strategic question of how this war ends. Does it end with Iran still capable of maritime extortion, enriched leverage, and proxy activation? Or does it end with those instruments broken badly enough that the region enters a different balance altogether? That is the real game under the public language. So when Washington says negotiations are continuing, that may be true. When it says a response is coming, that may also be true. And the tension between those two statements is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is the strategy itself. The Western alliance under strain. This war is not only testing Israel and Iran, it is also testing the cohesion of the Western alliance. That may not be the most visible battlefield, but it is one of the most important. Because whenever a crisis grows large enough to affect energy, shipping, military access, regional deterrence, and the credibility of collective defense, relationships between allies become part of the war itself. And right now, those relationships are under stress. The frustration coming from Washington toward Europe has become more visible. Complaints about insufficient support, hesitation, and unwillingness to act more decisively are now part of the public conversation. From the American perspective, that frustration is rooted in a simple argument. Europe has enormous stakes in the security of maritime routes, the balance of power in the Middle East, and the containment of a hostile Iranian regime. If that is true, then why is Europe not acting with more urgency? It is a fair question, but it is not the only one, because from the European side, there is another frustration, one shaped by months of political tension, strategic distrust, and the sense that Washington has often demanded loyalty while offering uncertainty in return. Alliances do not operate on strategic logic alone. They also operate on confidence. And when confidence has already been shaken, even genuine common interests can fail to produce immediate unity. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. All sides still need one another, but all sides are also irritated with one another. The result is a familiar problem in geopolitics. A shared threat does not automatically produce shared behavior. Sometimes it produces blame, hesitation, and mutual resentment precisely when unity is most needed. And yet the stakes here are too high for this fracture to continue, because if the war widens further, if maritime routes remain under pressure, if U.S. operations intensify, if Gulf infrastructure stays vulnerable, if regional proxies reactivate more aggressively, then Western disunity becomes a strategic gift to Tehran. Iran does not need to defeat the alliance militarily if it can exploit its political fragmentation. It only needs enough hesitation, enough division, enough misaligned expectations, and enough reluctance that the coalition against it never fully hardens. That is why this diplomatic front matters, not because alliance arguments are dramatic on camera, but because they shape what becomes possible off camera. Can logistics be shared? Can bases be used? Can pressure be coordinated? Can a maritime coalition form? Can political cover be provided for escalation if it becomes necessary? Can the war be ended in a way that the broader Western system can defend and sustain? All of that depends, in part, on whether the current strain is managed or allowed to deepen. And here lies the paradox. This war should be a moment for strategic clarity. Instead, it has exposed unresolved tensions inside the very camp most interested in containing Iran. That may still change. Major crises have a way of concentrating minds. But if it does not change, then the alliance may find itself confronting one of the world's most destabilizing regimes while still arguing internally over tone, trust, burden, and responsibility. That is exactly the kind of divided front Tehran would prefer, and exactly the kind of front the West cannot afford to present if the conflict moves into an even more dangerous phase. What a U.S. response could really mean. The most important question hanging over the war right now is simple. If the United States responds directly, what will that response actually look like? There is no shortage of speculation, and that speculation matters because the military posture in the region is already substantial. Forces have been moved, assets are in place. The language coming from Washington suggests that the menu of options has narrowed to the point where only timing and scale remain uncertain. But the most realistic response would not necessarily look like a full-scale invasion. That distinction matters. When people hear that the United States may respond, many imagine something massive and immediate, waves of strikes, dramatic televised escalation, a war opening overnight on a much larger scale. But modern strategy often moves differently, especially when the objective is not conquest, but coercion. What Washington may be preparing is not a war to occupy Iran. It may be a war to strip Iran of its last meaningful leverage. That would point toward limited but high-impact military action aimed at very specific objectives, areas tied to control of maritime routes, islands or strategic positions that function like locks on the Strait of Hormuz, sites linked to Iran's ability to hold shipping hostage, and perhaps, depending on intelligence and political calculations, infrastructure related to high-value nuclear material or strategic military continuity. In that sense, the likely logic is not broad territorial expansion, it is targeted strategic surgery, a move designed to say, this far and no further. You may survive as a regime for now, but you will not be allowed to emerge from this war still holding a knife to the world's throat. That is the real significance of the military buildup. The point is not simply force projection for its own sake. The point is to create credible options against the two areas where airstrikes and diplomatic threats may still be insufficient: maritime coercion and residual strategic capability. This is why the concept of limited ground action keeps appearing in serious analysis. Not because anyone wants another endless ground war in the Middle East. Quite the opposite. The entire logic depends on avoiding that. But if there are a few highly specific objectives that cannot be secured from the air, then planners must at least be ready to take them physically if diplomacy collapses. That is not the same as regime change by occupation. It is not the same as a march inland. It is not the same as trying to remake Iran from outside. It is a narrower, harsher logic. Remove the immediate strategic threat, impose a new reality, and then prevent Tehran from claiming that it can still extort the region after the bombing stops. Would such an operation be risky? Absolutely. Would it carry escalation dangers? Without question. Would it still be far smaller than a conventional invasion? Yes. And that is why this possibility is being treated so seriously. Because the credibility of the threat matters almost as much as the operation itself. If Iran believes Washington is bluffing, it may gamble. If it believes the United States is truly willing to use force in a limited but decisive way, then that belief alone may alter the negotiating landscape. In other words, the best case for the threat is that it never has to be carried out. But threats only work if they look real, and right now, the military environment increasingly suggests that the threat is meant to look very real indeed.
The Strait of Hormuz, the lever that could decide everything. There is one place in this war that matters so much it has almost become a character in the story. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow corridor is not just another map feature. It is one of the world's most critical strategic choke points. Oil, trade, shipping confidence, insurance costs, military signaling, and geopolitical credibility all converge there. If the war ends while that corridor remains vulnerable to Iranian coercion, then much of the conflict remains unresolved no matter what else is damaged. That is why the strait now sits at the center of everything. For Iran, it represents leverage. For the United States, it represents a red line. For Gulf states, it represents exposure. For markets, it represents instability. And for the wider world, it represents the difference between a regional war and a global economic shock. The issue is simple to describe and extremely difficult to manage. If Iran can restrict, tax, threaten, or selectively manipulate traffic through those waters, then it retains power far beyond the battlefield. It can say to the world, even if we are hit, even if we are weakened, we can still force you to deal with us on our terms. That is precisely what Washington appears determined to prevent. Because once a regime under pressure proves that it can weaponize one of the most sensitive maritime arteries on Earth and survive doing it, the implications go far beyond this war. It would set a precedent of strategic extortion under fire. And powerful states rarely accept that outcome willingly. That is why so much analysis now revolves around islands, maritime routes, convoy access, and tactical control over narrow channels. These are not peripheral details. They are the operational expression of a larger strategic objective. The war cannot truly end if Hormuz remains in the shadow of renewed Iranian pressure. And there is a second layer here that matters just as much. The strait is not only about energy, it is about narrative. Who leaves this war able to claim leverage? Who leaves it able to say the world still has to come to them? If Iran can say that despite everything, despite sanctions, strikes, diplomatic isolation, and regional pressure, it still controls one of the world's great economic choke points, then that becomes a political victory even amid military pain. That is why the United States cannot easily allow that outcome. So the struggle over Hormuz is not merely tactical, it is symbolic, strategic, and psychological all at once, and it is likely the single clearest reason why the war still feels unfinished. Because if the skies over Iran are contested, but the waters remain coercible, then the conflict has not really solved its central problem. It has only changed its form. That is also why so many conversations about the next step keep circling back to the same place. Not Tehran alone. Not central Israel alone. Not even only the nuclear question. Hormuz. Because the side that defines the post-war reality there may define the entire meaning of the war itself. Why Passover is unlikely to bring a pause. Many people understandably want to believe that a major holiday could create at least a short reduction in the violence. It is a human instinct. When a sacred date approaches, people hope for restraint. They hope that even bitter enemies might hesitate. They hope that the symbolism of the moment might force at least temporary quiet. But there is very little reason to believe that this war will behave that way. And that is one of the harshest truths facing Israel right now. The regime directing this confrontation does not operate according to the emotional expectations of those waiting for calm. It does not appear likely to pause because families are gathering. It does not appear likely to stop because a Seder meal is beginning. It does not appear likely to suddenly recognize the spiritual meaning of the moment for the people it sees as its enemy. This matters because wishful thinking can be dangerous in wartime. It creates false hope. It lowers vigilance. It encourages a kind of emotional disarmament precisely when discipline is still required. And the reality is that if anything, symbolic moments can sometimes become targets in wars driven by ideology. Holidays gather people. They create expectation. They shape national mood. That can make them strategically attractive moments for those who want to prove that normal life will not return so easily. That does not mean an attack is guaranteed at any given hour, but it does mean no one should build expectations around holiday mercy. What Israel appears to need now is the opposite: realism, preparedness, emotional discipline, and the clear understanding that the war will not respect the calendar unless one of the actors involved decides that doing so serves its interests. At the moment, there is no reliable sign of that. What there is instead is continued pressure, continued rhetoric, continued evidence that the conflict is still in motion. This is why many families are entering Passover with a split mindset. They want to hold on to the meaning of the holiday. They want to create continuity for children. They want to preserve tradition. They want to insist that war will not own every part of national life. And at the same time, they are behaving like people who know the danger remains very real. They are choosing where to gather based on shelter access. They are planning around alerts. They are watching the news while preparing for prayer. They are carrying faith and fear at the same time. That emotional contradiction may be the most accurate portrait of Israel right now. Not panic, not collapse, but a society determined to continue living while fully aware that the threat has not gone away. So, will the war quiet down for Passover? Possible, perhaps, in theory. Probable, no. Not under these conditions. Not with the current level of ideological rigidity, strategic escalation, and unresolved objectives. This is not the kind of conflict that slows because people wish it would. It slows when one side is forced to slow it, and that moment has not clearly arrived yet. Iran's mindset. Why the regime may not see the war the way the world does. One of the most dangerous aspects of this conflict is the possibility that the Iranian regime is not interpreting events through the same logic that many outside observers assume. From a conventional military perspective, the costs are obvious. Capabilities have been degraded, pressure is mounting, strategic assets are threatened, international isolation remains real. And yet there is a growing belief among some analysts that the regime may still think it can outlast its enemies, not because the battlefield is favorable in a traditional sense, but because its worldview is not fully governed by traditional cost-benefit logic. That matters immensely, because wars often end when leadership sees clearly that continuing will only make defeat worse. But what happens when leadership does not process defeat in ordinary terms? What happens when ideology filters reality so heavily that pain becomes proof of righteousness rather than proof of strategic failure? That is the fear here. The fear is that Tehran may still believe that endurance itself is a form of victory, that surviving the pressure, refusing the white flag, and holding out longer than the other side expects becomes its own ideological success, even if the material cost keeps rising. If that is true, then diplomacy becomes harder, because compromise requires not only pressure, but recognition. It requires the other side to understand that the path it is on leads somewhere intolerable. If the regime instead believes that surrender is spiritually impossible, politically fatal, or ideologically unthinkable, then even overwhelming pressure may not create the kind of capitulation that Western planners imagine. This is one reason why comparisons with other historical regimes can be misleading. Some dictatorships can be decapitated. Some collapse when the center of control breaks. Some calculate survival pragmatically and know when the game is up. But systems rooted in ideological militancy, distributed power networks, and deeply embedded revolutionary identity can behave differently. They can absorb shock far longer than outsiders expect because they are not merely protecting a government. They believe they are protecting a mission. That does not make them invincible. Far from it. But it does make them harder to coerce through conventional assumptions. And that may be one reason why the war has reached this stage at all. Because if Tehran still believes the West lacks stamina, still believes that political divisions will grow, still believes that the pain of oil shocks and escalation fears will ultimately restrain Washington more than they restrain Tehran, then it may continue wagering on time, that is the central danger. Not that the regime is strong in every dimension, but that it may still believe it can survive enough to claim strategic endurance. And in wars like this, a leadership that thinks it is surviving can become more dangerous than one that already knows it is losing. That is why pressure alone may not be enough. Pressure must be combined with clarity, with unmistakable consequences, with a visible reduction of leverage. And perhaps eventually, with a broader effort to convince the Iranian people themselves that the regime's path leads not to dignity, but to national ruin. Because if the regime cannot see reality clearly from above, then pressure may have to build from below as well. Can the Iranian people change the endgame? At some point, every serious discussion about this war runs into the same difficult question. If aerial pressure can damage the regime, but may not be enough to remove it, then who finishes the job? And that brings the conversation to the Iranian people. There is a powerful belief among many in the Iranian opposition, inside the country and in the diaspora, that the regime is vulnerable not only militarily but socially and politically, that beneath the surface of state control lies a country exhausted by repression, economic decay, corruption, fear, and a ruling structure that many ordinary citizens no longer truly believe in. That belief is not irrational. Iran has already seen waves of anger, unrest, and anti-regime sentiment over the years. The idea that the population could rise again is not fantasy. It is rooted in real history, real frustration, and real resistance. But there is also a hard truth here. Popular anger is not the same as operational capacity. A population can hate its rulers and still lack the means to overthrow them. That is especially true when a regime retains armed loyalists, coercive networks, intelligence machinery, internal surveillance, and a core constituency that remains committed enough to use force without hesitation. A majority can be discontented while a determined minority still controls the guns, the prisons, and the state. That is what makes internal regime change so difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And that is why talk of the people rising up cannot remain a slogan. If outside powers genuinely believe that internal change is part of the long-term answer, then there must eventually be something more than vague encouragement. There must be a credible plan for what support means, what protection means, what transition might look like, and what incentives exist for fractures inside the regime. Because without those elements, people inside Iran may ask a brutal but reasonable question. If we rise, who protects us when the crackdown comes? That question is central. It shapes risk. It shapes courage. It shapes whether hope becomes action or remains private. There is also the issue of messaging. If the West speaks only in terms of punishment, strikes, and threats, then it communicates danger, but not destination. If it speaks only to the regime, it can unintentionally weaken the confidence of the people. But if it speaks over the regime, directly to the Iranian nation, directly to the military rank and file, directly to officials who may fear being trapped in a losing system, then the war begins to acquire a political horizon beyond destruction. That matters because people need to know what comes after. What happens to sanctions? What happens to frozen assets? What happens to international acceptance? What happens to reconstruction? What happens to those inside the system who step aside? What happens to the country if the regime falls, fractures, or negotiates its own exit under pressure? Without answers to those questions, even a wounded regime can still argue that chaos is worse than continuity. So, can the Iranian people change the endgame? Yes, potentially. But not by magic, not by hope alone, and not without a much clearer strategy from those who claim they want that outcome. The war may yet create conditions in which internal pressure grows dramatically, but if that moment comes, it will need more than applause from abroad. It will need structure. It will need promises. It will need confidence that sacrifice leads somewhere real. And until that is made clear, the internal dimension of the war remains powerful, but unresolved. Saudi Arabia, normalization, and the new energy geography. One of the most intriguing long-term possibilities emerging from this war has nothing to do with a single missile strike or one military operation. It has to do with maps, energy maps, trade maps, alliance maps, because wars do not only destroy old arrangements, sometimes they accelerate new ones. And one of the biggest questions now is whether this conflict could speed up a strategic realignment involving Saudi Arabia, Israel, regional infrastructure, and the bypassing of vulnerable maritime choke points altogether. At the heart of this idea is a simple logic. If the Strait of Hormuz remains too dangerous to trust, then alternative routes become more valuable than ever. That is where discussions about pipelines, overland corridors, and broader regional integration become suddenly more relevant. An east-west energy corridor running across Saudi territory and linking into Israeli infrastructure would not just be an economic project, it would be a geopolitical transformation. It would reduce dependency on the strait, alter regional logistics, and create a new architecture of interdependence stretching from the Gulf toward the Mediterranean and beyond. In normal times, such visions can take years to develop and often remain trapped in diplomatic hesitation. But wars compress time. What once seemed distant can become urgent. What once looked speculative can begin to look strategic. And if the United States emerges from this conflict in a position to shape the post-war order more directly, then it may push harder for exactly this type of outcome. There is a certain brutal logic to it. If Iran has tried to weaponize geography, then answer by redesigning geography. If it has tried to exploit choke points, then create alternatives that weaken that leverage permanently. If it has relied on regional fragmentation, then answer with regional integration among its rivals. That would not be a temporary tactical win. It would be a structural defeat for Iran's long-term strategy. Of course, none of this is simple. Saudi Arabia has its own calculus, its own caution, and its own political sensitivities. Normalization is not merely a commercial decision. It is a regional, domestic, symbolic, and strategic choice all at once. But great crises can alter the terms of those choices. They can change who looks strong, who looks weak, and what becomes possible after fear begins to give way to new realities. If the Saudi leadership concludes that the post-war map will reward alignment with American-backed infrastructure and stable energy corridors more than ambiguity and delay, then this war could end up accelerating relationships that had previously moved too slowly. And if that happens, then something remarkable may occur. A conflict launched through coercion and chaos may inadvertently trigger a stronger corridor of cooperation among the very states Iran hoped to intimidate. That does not mean the transformation is guaranteed, but it is no longer hypothetical enough to ignore, because the deeper this war cuts into old assumptions, the more likely it becomes that the region will search for not just military answers, but systemic ones. And systemic answers tend to last longer than battlefield victories. Israel's resilience will be tested again. One of the recurring themes of this war has been resilience, the ability of Israeli society to absorb pressure, adapt under fire, and continue functioning despite multiple fronts, repeated alerts, and prolonged uncertainty has become one of the defining realities of the conflict. But resilience is not infinite, and holidays, especially one like Passover, test it in a different way. Because resilience in wartime is not only about surviving attacks, it is about preserving identity under pressure. It is about whether a society can keep telling its story, keeping its rituals, keeping its language of hope, even while the enemy tries to force life into a permanent state of interruption. That is why the coming days will matter beyond casualty counts and missile totals. They will matter psychologically. Can families gather and still feel like families, not just civilians under threat? Can children experience tradition without associating it only with fear? Can a nation preserve a sense of sacred time when public time is dominated by war? These are not sentimental questions. They are strategic ones. Because societies that remain emotionally coherent under attack are harder to break. That is one reason enemies target civilian routine in the first place. Not only to kill or damage, but to fracture rhythm, trust, and collective confidence. The siren is not just a warning, it is also a message. Your ordinary life is no longer yours. Israel's answer again and again has been refusal. Refusal to stop gathering, refusal to stop functioning, refusal to stop adapting. But refusal comes with a cost. Fatigue builds. Children absorb stress. Parents carry invisible weight. Communities stretch themselves over weeks of emergency discipline. And even strong societies can feel the strain when the horizon remains unclear. That is why hope matters right now. But not cheap hope, not false calm, real hope. The kind rooted in preparedness, realism, and the belief that survival is not only physical but moral. If Passover this year becomes a holiday under fire, then its meaning will change, not disappear, but change. It will become not only a remembrance of freedom in the past, but a declaration of endurance in the present. And perhaps that is why so many still insist on celebrating despite everything. Because to stop would mean giving the war control over more than the sky. It would mean giving it control over memory, identity, and continuity. That is something Israel has never accepted easily, and is unlikely to accept now. Final monologue. The holiday begins, but the real countdown is elsewhere. As this holiday begins, Israel stands in a strange and painful place. It is not at peace, but it is not without strength. It is not in control of the full regional picture. But it is not helpless inside it. It is not certain how the next week will unfold. But it knows the war has not ended. That may be the clearest truth of all. Passover is arriving, but the real countdown is not only to the evening meal, it is to the next strategic decision, the next American signal, the next Iranian calculation, the next shift in the skies, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the minds of leaders who now have to choose between pressure, compromise, or a much more dangerous escalation. That is why this moment feels so fragile. There is still a path to a narrower ending. There is still a path in which diplomacy, backed by fear of further force, produces a hard bargain and prevents an even larger war. But there is also another path. A path in which Tehran keeps betting on endurance. A path in which Washington decides its warnings have been ignored. A path in which the region passes from tension into a new and more direct phase of confrontation. And if that happens, this week will be remembered not as a pause in the war, but as the threshold before the next escalation. So will the war drag on through Passover? Everything right now suggests that it can. Everything right now suggests that Israelis should prepare not for guaranteed quiet, but for continued vigilance. And yet, there is another truth running alongside the fear. This country has faced enemies before. It has faced rockets, sieges, isolation, and uncertainty before. It has faced moments when the future looked suspended between prayer and warning before, and each time the question was not only whether danger was real, it was whether the people could endure it. That answer so far has always been yes. The sirens may come, the uncertainty may remain, the next move may still be hidden behind military secrecy and diplomatic language, but the people will still gather. The story will still be told, the light will still be lit, and even under fire, the holiday will still begin. Because that may be the deepest answer a society can give in wartime. You may darken the sky, but you do not get to erase who we are.